The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
There are artists who chase fame, and then there are artists who are consumed by it. Benny Andersson belongs to neither category entirely. He is something rare, a man who built one of the most recognizable sounds in music history, then quietly stepped back and let the world decide what it all meant. For decades, fans filled in the gaps with speculation, journalists wrote their theories, and the ABBA mythology grew larger than any of the four people inside it. But now, at 78 years old, Benny Andersson is finally speaking in a way he never quite allowed himself to before. Not defensively, not with carefully polished PR answers, but with the kind of honesty that only comes when a person has genuinely stopped caring what the verdict will be. And what he's confirming, slowly and in his own way, is something millions of fans have quietly sensed for 50 years, that behind those shimmering, euphoric melodies was a much more complicated and achingly human story. To understand Benny Andersson today, you have to go back to before ABBA existed, before the sequined costumes and the sold-out arenas and the global phenomenon that would define his life. You have to go back to a boy in Stockholm who heard music not as entertainment, but as a language he understood better than spoken words. Benny grew up immersed in Swedish folk traditions, in the sound of accordions and choir harmonies, and the kind of music that carries memory inside it. These weren't glamorous influences. They didn't point toward pop stardom, but they gave him something more valuable than ambition. They gave him an ear for emotional truth. From his earliest years, Benny demonstrated an instinct for melody that was almost impossible to teach. He could feel where a chord wanted to go before he understood the theory behind it. He played by sensation as much as by knowledge, and that combination would eventually become his greatest creative weapon. While other musicians learned the rules of composition, Benny was absorbing something older and harder to define, the understanding that music exists to carry feelings that human beings cannot otherwise express. That belief would shape every song he ever wrote, including the ones the whole world eventually sang along to. By the time he joined the Hep Stars in the 1960s, Benny was already developing the harmonic complexity that would later define ABBA's sound. He wasn't content with simple chord progressions. He layered emotions into his arrangements the way a painter layers colors, with each element serving the larger emotional picture. Those who worked with him during those early years noticed that he had an unusual quality. He could make a happy-sounding melody feel quietly devastating, and a melancholy chord progression feel strangely hopeful. That paradox would become ABBA's signature, though most listeners never knew exactly where it came from. When ABBA formed and began their ascent to global fame, the world quickly organized itself around the most visible elements of the group. Agnetha Faltskog and Annie Frid Lyngstad, known as Frida, were the faces and voices that the public fell in love with. Their harmonies were extraordinary, their stage presence magnetic, and their personal lives endlessly fascinating to a media hungry for stories. Benny and Bjorn Ulvaeus, by contrast, were often described simply as the men behind the music, a phrase that is both accurate and deeply insufficient. Because what Benny was doing in the studio during ABBA's peak years was not simply writing catchy songs. He was constructing emotional architecture. Every chord change in The Winner Takes It All was deliberately chosen to create a specific feeling of resigned dignity. The piano introduction to Fernando was designed to evoke space and distance, a sense of something vast and irretrievable. Even the joyful bounce of Dancing Queen contains subtle harmonic tensions that stop it from ever feeling entirely carefree. These choices weren't accidents. They were the work of a man who understood, on a deep and instinctive level, that the most powerful music is music that holds contradictory emotions simultaneously. Benny has reflected in recent years that he never felt like a star within ABBA, not because he resented the singers, but because he recognized that his role was fundamentally different from theirs. The singers delivered the emotion to the audience. Benny created the emotional landscape that made that delivery possible. He was the architect, and like most architects, he watched other people live inside the buildings he had designed. There is something genuinely poignant about that image. A man pouring his interior life into compositions that the world would attribute, understandably but incompletely, to the voices singing them. What he has confirmed in more recent conversations is that this invisibility was not entirely comfortable. He wanted his craft to be seen, not for the sake of fame, but for the sake of honest recognition. He built something real, something that required immense emotional investment and technical mastery, and he watched it be described repeatedly as pop fluff or disco hits. For a man who had constructed those songs out of genuine personal experience, that dismissal cut in ways he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge publicly. Perhaps the most significant confirmation Benny has offered in his later years concerns the relationship between his personal life and his musical output. He and Frida were romantically involved throughout much of ABBA's most productive period, and their relationship was a genuine love story, complicated, intense, and ultimately unsustainable. What Benny has now acknowledged is something that fans long suspected from simply listening carefully to the music. The songs were not just inspired by personal experience. They were a substitute for it. Benny has described himself as someone who was always more emotionally available in the studio than in ordinary life. When feelings became difficult to manage, he went to the piano. When conversations needed to happen, he wrote instead. The result was some of the most emotionally resonant popular music of the 20th century, and a private life marked by the kind of distance that creativity can create when it becomes a person's primary emotional outlet. Frida needed someone who could be present in the unscripted moments of daily life. Benny gave her art instead, and while the art was extraordinary, it was not the same thing. This dynamic explains something that thoughtful ABBA listeners have always felt but struggled to articulate. Songs like One of Us and The Winner Takes It All don't sound like theatrical performances of emotion. They sound like actual emotion, raw and unresolved, wearing the costume of a pop song. That quality came from the fact that they were, in some genuine sense, letters that Benny couldn't send in person. He has acknowledged this directly, noting that he gave his best and most honest expressions to songs rather than to the people who most needed to hear them from him directly. That confession reframes the entire ABBA catalog in a subtle but profound way. It also speaks to something universal about the relationship between creative work and personal life. Many artists use their work to process what they cannot process otherwise. The risk is that the work becomes so effective at providing emotional relief that the artist loses the motivation to do the harder, messier work of actual human connection. Benny recognizes now that this is precisely what happened to him during the ABBA years. The music worked. It gave him release, structure, and the feeling of having expressed something true. But the people around him experienced his emotional absence, not his art. One of the aspects of ABBA's internal dynamic that has received less attention over the years is the role Benny played as the group's emotional stabilizer. When creative tensions arose, when the pressures of constant touring and public life created friction, Benny was frequently the one expected to smooth things over. He managed not just musical arrangements, but interpersonal arrangements, the delicate equilibrium that kept four complex, talented, and romantically entangled people functioning as a professional unit. This role, which he accepted without ever formally agreeing to it, took a significant toll. He has spoken about the quiet exhaustion of being the person who held things together while experiencing his own doubts and struggles internally. There was nowhere for Benny to fall apart, because he was the one preventing everyone else from falling apart. That kind of sustained emotional labor leaves marks, even when it leaves no visible bruises. And it contributed to the growing sense, during ABBA's later years, that he was present in body, but increasingly distant in spirit. By the time ABBA's momentum began to slow in the early 1980s, Benny was running on obligation rather than inspiration. He has been remarkably candid about this in recent reflections, acknowledging that toward the end of the group's active period, he stayed not because he felt creatively alive within the band, but because leaving felt like a betrayal of everything they had built together. He felt responsible for the machine, even after the machine had stopped feeding him anything meaningful in return. That kind of loyalty is admirable and also, in its own way, a trap. The end of ABBA, when it came, arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a gradual quieting. There was no definitive meeting, no signed agreement to dissolve. There was simply a moment, or a series of moments, where the music stopped feeling honest, and without honesty, Benny had no reason to continue. For a man who had always used music to tell the truth about his interior life, Creating music that felt hollow was not just professionally unsatisfying. It was something closer to a personal crisis. After ABBA faded from active existence, Benny disappeared from the kind of public life the band had occupied. He didn't retire. He was constitutionally incapable of stopping work, but he redirected his energies toward projects that allowed him to create without the particular pressures that had accumulated around the ABBA name. He composed for theater, wrote orchestral music, and worked on projects like the musical Chess and the deeply personal Christina Fran de Vemela. These were not commercial calculations. They were a man rebuilding his relationship with music after the relationship had been damaged. This period, which lasted through much of the 1980s and 1990s, was also a period of internal reckoning. Benny has mentioned that he spent years processing feelings he had never properly addressed during ABBA's peak. He had suppressed so much about his relationship with Frida, about his sense of creative invisibility, about the exhaustion of holding a group together while his own needs went unacknowledged, that the silence after ABBA created a kind of emotional backlog. He worked through it gradually, imperfectly, in the way that people do when they've spent years avoiding something and finally run out of places to avoid it. What emerged from that period was not bitterness, which would have been understandable, but something closer to clarity. Benny began to understand the patterns of his own life with the same structural insight he had always brought to musical composition. He could see how his tendency to use creativity as an emotional escape had shaped his relationships. He could see how his need for recognition had expressed itself as resentment rather than as communication. He could see, with the honest and sometimes uncomfortable vision of hindsight, the person he had been and the people he had failed to be present for. At 78, Benny Andersson has arrived at a place that is rare for someone who experienced the level of fame and scrutiny that ABBA generated. He has arrived at genuine acceptance, not the performed acceptance of someone who has made peace with their public image, but the real thing, earned through decades of honest reflection. And what he is confirming now, in the careful and measured way that suits his personality, is everything that attentive listeners and thoughtful observers have long suspected. He is confirming that ABBA's music was never as simple as it sounded, that behind the perfect productions and the irresistible melodies was a group of people using music to survive their circumstances, their broken relationships, their creative frustrations, their fear of emotional exposure, and their genuine love for the craft that had brought them together. He is confirming that he was never the cold technical mind that some portrait suggested, but a deeply feeling person who had learned, early and thoroughly, to express those feelings through sound rather than through direct human contact. He is confirming that the songs people have sung at weddings and funerals and in cars on long drives were written by someone who was, in those moments of creation, completely and vulnerably honest in a way he struggled to be anywhere else. And he is confirming, perhaps most importantly, that none of this diminishes what ABBA was. If anything, it explains why the music has survived while so many other acts from the same era have faded. People feel ABBA's songs rather than simply hearing them, and now we understand more clearly why. Those songs were built from real pain, real longing, real confusion, and real love, processed by a remarkable musical mind and delivered to the world in the most accessible and beautiful form possible. There is something deeply moving about a man at 78 finally allowing the full story to be heard, not because he is seeking sympathy or attempting to rewrite history, but simply because the truth is lighter to carry than the version of events he has held at arm's length for decades. Benny Andersson spent his most creative years giving the world music that made people feel seen and understood. It is quietly fitting that in his later years, he is finally allowing himself the same courtesy. ABBA was never a fairy tale. It was something better than that. It was real and complicated and achingly human. And somehow, despite everything, it produced music that will outlast everyone who ever argued about what it all meant. Perhaps that is the most honest confirmation of all.